Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about this subject. It's one that I've been thinking about for a long, long time. The National Intelligence Council, which I've had the opportunity to serve as both vice chair and chair, has been thinking about it for a long time as well. We started, I think now about 20 years ago, asking the question, if we assume that the UN Intergovernmental Panel is right and global warming is happening, then who will be the winners and who will be the losers? So that was the first piece of work the NIC did now, I think, more than 20 years ago. So it's been at it for a good long time and been trying to think about the implications. We now know pretty clearly that sadly, the winners, if there are any winners from global warming, will be in the north. There'll be countries like perhaps Canada or Russia. And the global south, by and large, is not going to be a winner. So it's sort of triply hurt by this. It didn't cause much of global warming because it hasn't emitted much carbon, but it also doesn't have much ability to deal with the problems that it faces, and it will be most affected. So it's a circumstance that does cry out, I think, for thinking about the implications for national security. Starting with sort of operational ones, the things that are most visible and direct for the military services in particular are the things they're going to have to do to continue operations. They're going to have to worry about sea level rise. If you think how low-lying most of Norfolk is, the big naval base there, so we have to worry about things like that. They're already deeply concerned, I think, about the combination of natural, though we know these are not natural events. These global warming is caused by humans, not by Mother Nature, so unfair to blame her. But they're worried about the combination of a natural disaster with a cyber event, a cyber attack. And so that's something they're deeply concerned about. They've been building microgrids so that if the worst happens, they can continue to operate. Interestingly, that's necessary, I think, for national security purposes, but it does run in rather the opposite direction for what we're trying to do more generally with grids. We're trying to enlarge electrical grids so we can move renewable power around. One of the problems with renewable is it's not reliable. You can't know when the sun's going to be out or when there's going to be wind. So we need bigger grids to move that power from where it's being produced to where it might be needed at a particular time. But for understandable reasons, the military has gone in the other direction and trying to do microgrids to protect itself from outages caused by some combination of natural, and again in quotation marks, phenomena and perhaps cyber events. Plainly, the military and other parts of the national security establishment are trying to diminish their carbon footprint, moving toward electrical vehicles. There, the real challenge, I think, is air power and air forces, since with current battery technology, for any given weight, a battery can only contain about 2% the power of jet fuel stored. So we're a long way from serious big aircraft that are electric, but that's really the direction we're trying to go. The second big area, I think, is really what effect this will have on national security operations. Now, more than 20 years ago, when I was running the national estimates process as vice chair of the NIC, we got an interesting request for an estimate from the U.S. military's Transportation Command, TRANSCOM, and they sensibly understood that if there were humanitarian emergencies, they were going to be asked to move stuff, to move relief supplies to those afflicted areas. And they asked the question, where might those arise? Because they were interested in whether or not there would be airports, seaports, places to deliver humanitarian supplies, primarily in Africa, but not just. Well, it was an interesting question because sadly, or for better or for worse, predicting humanitarian emergencies is not all that hard. We know they typically arise from one of two causes. One is weather events, particularly drought, and the other is conflict, internal conflict. Neither of those is terribly hard to predict. So it was an interesting exercise. It was great for the NIC because we basically asked a dozen NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, to come and start the process with us at a conference. And needless to say, they weren't wildly enthusiastic about us as sort of doubly damned, both government and intelligence. But in the end, their reservations were outweighed by the simple fact that we were doing something they cared about. And so they all came and in effect presented the first draft of an estimate. So that was the sort of the beginning of thinking about what are the operational implications of the environment for national security operations. As we know, looking forward, that seems to me will be the second big area where national security is affected. We know that there are going to be more people on the move as drought, desertification, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere as well, happens, or as places become underwater. So some of those will, as we've seen in the European case, result in tragedies as unfit ships sink in the Mediterranean. So there'll be obviously a big search and rescue operation in our hemisphere as well, since many of the lowest lying islands in the world are in the Caribbean. So there are going to be a movement from those places. More generally, there will be people moving into places where they're either not wanted or not able to be sustained, and that will be a source of conflict. So in addition to the humanitarian dimension, trying to help people who need food and our shelter, there will also be the conflict dimension, which will raise questions about how do we intervene, do coalitions of the willing, can the UN do it, peacekeeping, raise a whole host of issues, I think, and we've only begun to see those come up. We know, for instance, that the conflict in Sudan, Darfur, is essentially about water, and we're going to see many more of those kinds of conflicts arising, I fear. And so that will mean a whole set of challenges for U.S. national security policy about what it does. We'll be more affected, it seems to me, through our friends than we will be directly, but the direct effects are obviously going to be big on us too. Mostly, it seems to me, we'll continue to face the questions about how we help our friends or allies or simply people who are in need around the world. And we can only imagine that that set of contingencies is going to grow pretty dramatically as we have continued global warming and more intense, frequent weather events. I suppose the last thing I would mention is further in the future, and that is there is a kind of, I would call it a grudging consensus, nobody likes it much, that we're probably not going to meet, we're certainly not on track to meet the Paris goals of reducing global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in the end, we're probably going to need what until recently was kind of a dirty word, climate engineering, geoengineering. We're going to have to do something, at least in an interim, if we're not going to meet the Paris targets, as we surely are not, then we're going to have to think about at least some interim measures to geoengineer. The most plausible at the moment is probably injecting aerosols into the stratosphere, but that cries out then for both international conversations and also for some sense of monitoring, verifying, since you can, if you do that, inject aerosols into the stratosphere, you affect the whole world, then that again cries out for international conversations. And already I think there's concern that there could be unilateral efforts to do things, and we ought to find ways both to negotiate agreements not to do them, but also then use the capacities we have to begin to monitor and make sure there aren't rogue operations out there. We've seen certainly in Europe the pressures of migration, particularly from North Africa, and in some sense what's happened is a social phenomenon that we expected to happen over a longer period of time, compressed in time scale. Obviously, Europe, as it ages, needs people, and most of those people will come from the Middle East and North Africa, we think, and so that's been a powerful stimulus to the EU to try and get its act together. It hasn't done terribly well at that, at making sure that the refugee flows are spread across the community. Some countries have said no. Some countries, even like Hungary and Poland, that don't have many migrants, have also been very reluctant to take new ones. So in a sense, what we have is, it seems to me, a competition between economics and humanitarian issues on the one hand, economics arguing for migration to Europe. On the other hand, there is this cultural resistance to too much migration in Europe, which is, I think, will continue. We saw it in Brexit, in which migration, which wasn't in fact a real factor, was a major factor in the debate. So I fear that will continue, that we'll continue to have this collision between economic and humanitarian needs on the one hand, and the willingness of cultures and societies to accept migrants on the other. If you looked even at the economics, to replace the workers that Europe is going to lose through aging populations, that would require something like 35 times the current migration from Africa. Well, that plainly isn't going to happen. So there'll continue to be, I think, that resistance, and some of it will turn into the kind of ugliness we've seen in Mediterranean drownings and other issues. So far, the EU, the European Union, has mostly relied on Turkey, sort of much as we in the United States tend to rely on Mexico to solve their migration problem, and that can't continue. The Arctic is plainly becoming a big national security issue because really of global warming. We've seen the ice melts in both the passages, and that means that shipping, still not much of it, but shipping will particularly begin to take the northern passage, particularly the one north of Russia, which is less ice-filled than the one across Canada. That will become a sea line. That then raises issues for Russia, gives them in some sense yet another border or frontier, one they'll be concerned about. We've already seen the Arctic Council break down over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what was once pretty impressive cooperation in the Arctic looks much more frayed, and the kind of security issues that are of concern are growing, as particularly the transit. There's much talk about minerals and other things being available up there, but for the moment, I think it'll be mostly transit and concerns by Russia that they want to police that sea lines to their north. That I think is bound to make for issues. We see China getting engaged as well. Those are the sort of immediate national security issues. The longer-term effects could be enormous if we get something like, as some of the models project, if we get an end to those ocean currents that make Europe much warmer, that make those palm trees at London tube stations happen, that would make a dramatic change in Europe's climate. And some of the models suggest that those currents will be affected by global warming, and in ways that will have pretty dramatic changes, pretty dramatic effects on the climate of Europe, not just Europe, but other places as well. So the Arctic, which had been an impressive zone of peace and cooperation, now unfortunately looks like it is going to be an issue of at least some geopolitical competition. If we look at Southeast Asia, there the challenge is that they're going to be affected, and there's not going to be, as far as I can tell, any winners in Southeast Asia. The kind of incredible heat we've seen in India recently is likely to continue. Bangladesh is a particular concern because it's been doing actually rather well economically and been quite a haven for some refugees, but it's so low-lying that the chances that much of it will be underwater at some point are pretty great. So Southeast Asia is obviously a place that's going to be badly hit, and that will then require us in the United States to think what we do about it. How much effect China will have, obviously China's continuing to invest through their Belt Road Initiative. As their economic growth slows, though it's still going to be pretty impressive by our standards, I think that'll be more of an issue. Already we've seen concerns about the inability of many of the countries that have borrowed money from China to pay it back, and that I think will grow. No doubt China will use or try to benefit from the environmental difficulties by providing some assistance. How much they can, how their limits, I think we'll find out. It does seem to me that the Belt Road Initiative has got them pretty overextended, given the demographics they face and given the likelihood of slower economic growth. But they will certainly want to be active and try and be as helpful as they can in their region as climate causes more and more challenges. Yeah, I think we see the great power rivalry playing out, particularly in Africa, but also in Central Asia and elsewhere, and that will continue. I think it'll probably be sharpened to some extent by the climate, by environmental concerns. Again, it much turns on the ability, how much wherewithal and capacity the countries have to provide support and help. For China, it'll be sort of a natural extension of their Belt Road Initiative to try and do things, build projects that may be useful in mitigating some of the worst effects of climate change in African countries, Asian countries, and elsewhere. So I think there'll be that continuing sort of subterranean and maybe not so subterranean competition among the great powers, where I think, again, a lot depends simply on how much capacity. Russia has lots of interest in Africa and a kind of a reservoir of goodwill from its days in opposing colonialism and apartheid, but not a lot of wherewithal, obviously, to help those countries. Yeah, what's striking to me about the Amazon, obviously it is plainly hugely important to the whole globe, and that fact makes it all the more striking that we really have no real mechanisms for global cooperation. We've got the Paris agreements, but they're voluntary. We got somehow we've now recently said that the rich countries will provide some support for the worst effects in poor countries of extreme weather events. That's a beginning. But in an ideal world, since we need the Amazon to stay the Amazon rainforest, not to be a set of farms, we ought to find some way to compensate those farmers, those Brazilian farmers that don't tear down the rainforest. And we're unfortunately a long way from that. Having a new administration that's more environmental friendly in Brazil helps, but it can't do it on its own. And the rainforest for me is the most striking example of the thing we don't have, which is really mechanisms for serious international cooperation that not only put countries on notice to do something, but in some ways kind of penalize them if they don't. Drive home again what that famous Earthrise picture now 50 plus years ago showed, and that is we all inhabit this same small, lonely planet, and we're all in it together, but we're a long way from mechanisms that reflect that.